Hello guys, today I will show how to create a Spring Batch microservice for long-running tasks. I will show how to create a Spring Batch project from zero. I will show two different ways to configure a job and two different ways to run a job. Before starting, I will just ask you to subscribe to my channel because this is very important for me. And let's go! Let's first explain some of the main components of Spring Batch, and I will then implement a real example. With Spring Batch, I can configure jobs to be run at different times, in parallel, or when calling an endpoint. Those jobs will be composed by a single step or by multiple steps. Those steps used to share a final goal. They used to be connected. I may have a job which updates the user information, and the steps can be import the new users from a file, update some users' activity, and delete the old accounts. I can chain all the steps in a linear way. If the first one fails, the rest won't run. Or I can have the independent steps. If the first one fails, the second one continues. But I can connect the steps in some other ways, in some more complicated ways. I can configure the steps with a retry mechanism. I can configure the steps to be executed in a repeated way, as a loop. I can configure a step to run depending on the result of the previous job. Or I can run multiple steps in parallel. A single step is usually composed of three items: a reader, a processor, and a writer. Spring Batch already have multiple readers and writers to read or write from multiple databases, CSV files, JSON files, Kafka, Mongo, and more. But of course, I can create my own reader and writer. With this approach, the output of the reader will be passed as an input of the processor. Then the processor will handle an item and return it. This entity will be passed then to the writer. Finally, the writer will save the entity in the desired destination. If my batch job doesn't fit in this model, I also have the tasklets. The tasklets are simple actions that can be run as a step. In this case, with the tasklets, I can operate whatever action I want inside the tasklet definition. Maybe I need some more complicated aggregation operations that hardly fit in the previous step definition. So, why choosing the reader, processor, and writer instead of a tasklet? What happens if I have a lot of data to handle that doesn't even fit in the memory? With the tasklet, I have to manage by myself the pagination, but with the reader, processor, and writer, I can define a chunk size. With the chunk size, Spring Batch will automatically handle the pagination when reading, when processing, and when writing the data. Let's go now create a Spring Batch microservice with a real example. I will start creating a new project with Spring Initializer. And let's add some dependencies. Spring Batch, of course. Cloud Bootstrap to have the cloud context. Actuator to monitor my servers. Web to let me trigger the job from an endpoint. GPA as I will import and edit data in the database. The config client as I have a distributed configuration server. And the Eureka client for the service discovery. And now I will add the Postgres as I have a Postgres database. And Lombok for code generation. Let's now download it and open it in IntelliJ. I will create a job which will perform some actions on my users table and import some new users from a file. I've added the user entity which reflects the table in my database and the associated repository. I've also added the password configuration to generate the password for the imported users. And I've created a DTO which reflects the columns of the imported CSV file. Let's now create the job. I will first create the steps which will import the new users from a CSV file. This is the name of the step. It will be useful later when monitoring the job. I read the files in chunks of 100 elements. I need to indicate the objects that will use the processor as input and output. Let's now create the reader. I will use a reader created by Spring Batch. This reader is already prepared to read CSV files. I indicate the file to read, located in the resource folder. I want to skip the first line, as here will be located the headers. Then I specify the delimited character. The default one is the comma. If I want another delimited character, I need to indicate it. Then the name of the fields per columns. That will be mapped into my DTO. And finally, the target DTO to store each line of the CSV file. Let's continue with the processor. The item read is the previously used DTO. The main purpose of the processor is to map the DTO into the entity object. The rest is only to generate a random password for the imported users. And finally, the writer. For each item received, for each chunk received, I store it with the repository. And now I need to integrate this step in a job. That's the name of the job. I also indicate that each time the job is run, I will use an incremented ID. And the job starts by the step I've created. And if I want to add another step, like a tasklet, I need to edit my job like that. And let's create this tasklet, which is another step. As each step, I need to name it. Inside the tasklet, I update the age of each user in the database, calculating it from the birthday. Finally, I return the status finished. Before starting the service, I've edited my application YAML. I've added the context path to access the available endpoints. I will create one later. I've added the health check configuration for Actuator. I've configured the database for JPA. I've configured a RICA to talk with the service discovery. And here is the batch-specific configuration. I indicate to try always to create the schema with the follow-up tables of Spring Batch. And in this script is located the queries to create those tables. There are other SQL scripts depending on the database. Now I'm ready to start my batch. Here I can see that the job was run successfully. Let's check my database. I see multiple tables created by Spring Batch. This one reflects the definition of all the jobs. Those will inform me about all the executions. I will see if they were successful or not, and with which parameters they were started. And if the job failed, I will see the stack trace. I will have a similar information in the steps table. I will see the status of each step linked to each available job. The previous job started directly when starting the service, but I may want to start the job when calling an endpoint. Let's create this endpoint. As I only have one job created in my project, the auto-ward is easy. And my job doesn't need any parameter, that's why I leave this empty. Finally, the job launcher will start the job in a background thread and continue with the execution. This makes my job start asynchronously. My endpoint won't get blocked until my job finishes. Okay, let's make a quick recap. I've created a new project with the dependency Spring Batch and some others to connect to my cloud architecture, as the service discovery, the distributed configuration, and the database. I've added the entities and repositories as usual with Spring JPA. I've created the batch configuration bin with the annotation Enable Batch Processing. I've created two steps. The first one was composed of a reader, a processor, and a writer to read a CSV file and store it in the database. The second step was a tasklet, which only updates the age of each user. I've created a job chaining those two steps. Then I've edited my application YAML to indicate to create the follow-up tables. And finally, I've created a controller with the job launcher to start the job asynchronously. That's all for today. Thank you to be there until the end of the video. Feel free to leave a comment about what you liked of the video, or about what topics you want me to handle in the next videos. And don't forget to click on the thumbs up and see you soon. Bye!